China's national security chiefs must be ready for worst-case scenarios, Xi Jinping says. Chinese debt trap endangers U.S. national security. China and India's political spat takes on journalists. Trying to support Taiwan, Fiji suffers extreme pressure from Beijing.
At a recent meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping urged officials to prepare for the worst-case scenarios in a somber warning on national security. As the state media Xinhua news agency cited, Xi on May 30th told the National Security Commission, "The complexity and difficulty of the national security issues we now face have increased significantly. We must adhere to bottom-line thinking and worst-case scenario thinking and get ready to undergo the major tests of high winds and rough waves and even perilous stormy seas." The remarks were made as China faces growing tensions with powerful democracies. It was announced on May 29th that the U.S., Philippines, and Japan were holding a trilateral maritime exercise in the South China Sea, a region heated with territorial disputes between China and neighboring countries. She also urged officials to advance a system to monitor national security risk, increase national security awareness, and improve data management and artificial intelligence security. Over the past month, China has restricted foreign access to public databases and clamped down on Western due diligence firms under its updated counter-espionage law. A Japanese executive was detained in March under the law. In May, Beijing banned American chip giant Micron with vague explanations for their failure to uphold security measures. The Wall Street Journal reported on May 18th that the country switched from wanting all foreign investment earlier this year to emphasizing high-quality foreign investments. Reportedly, it means that those help boost and secure domestic industries like Tesla. Such is somewhat reflected in Xi's speech on May 30th. He said that China must work to establish a safe external environment that would better safeguard the security of its opening up and foster the deep integration of development and security. China's debt trap diplomacy, which involves providing substantial loans to developing countries, is causing global concern. These loans, often kept secret and have strict terms, threaten to destabilize many developing economies. Governments struggling to pay their debts are making concessions to China with potentially serious implications for U.S. national security. Joel Rubin, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration, said the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to expand its influence across the Pacific has been to coerce and cut deals. China targets countries that have strategic importance for their navy, in particular for basing. For much of the world, the clock has struck midnight. According to a recent Fortune report, a dozen countries most indebted to China, including Pakistan, Kenya, Zambia, Laos, and Mongolia, are facing economic turmoil or collapse due to the impact of the loans they received from China. Moreover, paying back the debt is consuming an even greater amount of their tax revenue needed to keep schools open, provide electricity, and pay for food and fuel, forcing them to make tough choices in national spending. Notably, countries in debt to China often cannot seek relief from other leaders due to the secrecy of their Chinese loan terms. Many analysts call it China's debt trap, with near impossible loan terms as planned, forcing countries to cede strategically important interests to China, which then controls their assets after they cannot repay their debt. These mentioned countries had as much as 50% of their foreign loans from China and were devoting more than a third of government revenue to pay off foreign debt. Zambia and Sri Lanka need help to make interest payments on loan financing to the construction of ports, mines, and power plants. The number of textile workers laid off in Pakistan has reached millions because the country has too much foreign debt and cannot afford to keep the electricity and machines running. In Kenya, thousands of civil service workers have had paychecks held back to save cash to pay for foreign loans. The president's chief economic advisor tweeted, "Salaries or default, take your pick." The most famous example of a Chinese debt trap is in Sri Lanka. Since the country defaulted a year ago, 500,000 industrial jobs have vanished, inflation has soared 50%, and more than half the country's population has fallen into poverty. Sri Lanka has also ceded control of the strategically important Hambantota port to China. Experts predict that there could be a wave of more defaults and political upheavals unless China begins to soften its stance on loans to countries that can never repay them. implications for U.S. national security, and the way forward. In recent years, the United States has received many calls for intervention and relief for countries entangled in China's debt. But according to Rubin, the United States should refrain from splashing money on this. Instead, it needs to develop partnerships with developing countries, making them less likely to ask China for help. Rubin said, "The idea is to have them say no. I think this is one of the interesting questions about national security. How do we advance our national security?" Rubin said. Is it just putting money into defense? No. Rubin points to promoting economic ties as a way to strengthen the security of the United States, including development aid that helps these countries grow their economies while developing relationships that also benefit the United States. For example, he said the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, is an excellent way to strengthen economic ties. That trade agreement was one of the major strategic steps to create an architecture across the Pacific Rim countries of connectivity through economic and trade actions. That kind reduces the incentive of countries to cut deals with China because they may be penalties because there are positive alternatives. Rubin clarifies the defense investment is also essential to deter China and reassure allies in Asia that the United States is committed to their security. Still, defense is only one pillar contributing to the long-term goal of constraining China's ambitions. Rubin said, China is playing the long game. China has been thinking about this for decades, and they're thinking about this for decades out, adding that the American strategy should be to respond with more than defense spending in mind, adding, it's not a trade-off, like one or the other. You should and could and need to do both. The last thing you ever want is an actual war, right? So we have to build confidence.
China and India are shutting their doors on reporters from each side as tensions between the neighbors intensify. The Wall Street Journal reported from sources on May 30th that India had refused to renew visas for the last two Chinese state media reporters that month, one of whom was from state-backed Xinhua news agency, and the other from China Central Television, also a Chinese Communist Party or CCP-run media outlet. The sources said the two Chinese reporters had left India after their visas expired. The country has no operating Chinese state media journalists for the first time since probably the 1980s. China has also taken similar steps against Indian reporters. Two reporters, one from The Hindu, a prominent Indian newspaper, and one from Prasar Bharati, India's state-owned public broadcaster, were barred from returning to the mainland in April while traveling outside the country. In May, a third journalist from the Hindustan Times was informed that his accreditation would be invalidated. Tensions between India and China generally revolve around the disputed border in the Himalayan region. Troops from both sides had the first fatal confrontation in decades in June 2020. Unsubstantiated reports say the death toll included 4 soldiers from China and at least 20 from India. Another clash happened in January 2021. With injuries suffered on both sides. This year, Beijing angered India by renaming parts of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, which it claims as its territory, and referring to it as South Tibet. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said Beijing's take on Indian journalists was appropriate countermeasures after New Delhi began to limit rules on Chinese reporters in 2017. India has largely declined to comment on the matter. But a spokesman for the country's Ministry of External Affairs in April said India still allows Chinese journalists to work there and wishes China would do the same for Indian journalists.
Fiji is a country with more than 300 islands in the South Pacific and has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Since Taiwan established diplomatic relations with Fiji in 1971, Taiwan's representative office in the archipelago has always taken the name Trade Mission of the Republic of China, Taiwan of the Republic of Fiji. But in 2018, China's regime forced Fiji to rename the office Taipei Trade Office in Fiji. Since then, Taiwan has repeatedly asked Fiji to back its old name. Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka has led Fiji since late 2022. Whose government has highly appreciated Taiwan's contribution to Fiji in many areas, including agriculture, law, health, education, and training. In March, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA, announced that Fiji had agreed to restore the name of Taiwan's representative office in the country. The MOFA thanked Fiji for the decision and called it an important like-minded partner of Taiwan for cooperation in the Pacific region. However, according to Taiwan News, on June 1st, MOFA said it could not rename its representative office in Fiji. Ministry said that Jeff Liu, Fiji, was under extreme pressure from the Chinese Communist regime. China's regime has always pressured all countries and organizations supporting Taiwan. Many countries, unable to withstand the pressure from Beijing, have announced that they are severing diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The CCP claims that there is only one China and Taiwan is an inseparable part of its territory.